I stood on my own front porch holding my 2 grandchildren's trembling hands, while my husband of 40 years slid divorce papers toward me. Beside him, a woman young enough to be our daughter folded her arms and smiled as though she'd already won. "Pack your bags," she said. "This house has no room for a leech." I looked from her polished smile to my husband's empty eyes. Less than an hour earlier, I'd learned I had inherited $24 million and a skyscraper in Manhattan. The news was still tucked inside my purse in a thick envelope that neither of them noticed. Instead of crying, I smiled. "What's so funny?" she snapped. I took a slow breath, met her eyes, and answered, "Actually, this house belongs to—" But before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand how an ordinary 62-year-old grandmother ended up standing on that porch with the biggest secret of her life, resting quietly against my hip. My name is Margaret Carter, though almost everyone calls me Maggie. If you'd met me the week before all this happened, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. I worked 3 afternoons a week at the public library in our town in Westchester County, New York. I loved helping children discover books and retirees find new authors. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave my days purpose. For 40 years, my husband Richard and I had built what I believed was a respectable life. We hadn't started with much. Our first apartment had peeling wallpaper, a refrigerator that rattled all night, and exactly 2 lawn chairs serving as dining room furniture. Richard had dreamed of owning a construction company, and I believed in him enough to work double shifts at a doctor's office while he got his business off the ground. There were years when I balanced the books after putting our children to bed. Years when I skipped buying myself a winter coat because the company needed another truck. Years when I smiled through worry so Richard wouldn't lose confidence. Eventually, his business succeeded. People praised him for being self-made. I never corrected them. That wasn't because I wanted recognition. Marriage isn't supposed to keep score. At least that's what I believed. Our daughter Emily was now 38, raising 2 wonderful children after a painful divorce. Money was always tight for her, but she refused to complain. She worked hard as a physical therapist and somehow still found time to bake cookies for every school fundraiser. Our son Ben was 35 and taught American history at a public high school. He loved his students the way good teachers always do. He often joked that history wasn't really about dates. It was about choices. I thought about that sentence often after everything changed. On the morning my life turned upside down, nothing seemed unusual. I shelved books until noon, chatted with Mrs. Delaney about a mystery novel she'd just finished, and laughed with a little boy who proudly announced he'd finally learned to read chapter books. Around 1 o'clock my cell phone vibrated. The number was unfamiliar. Normally I let unknown callers go to voicemail, but something told me to answer. "Mrs. Margaret Carter," a calm man's voice asked. "This is she." "My name is David Rosen. I'm an estate attorney in Manhattan. I'm calling regarding your great-aunt Eleanor Whitmore." I nearly dropped the phone. "My great-aunt Eleanor?" "Yes, ma'am." I hadn't seen Aunt Eleanor in years. She was one of those fascinating relatives children whispered about during holiday dinners. She'd never married, wore elegant hats even in ordinary weather, and somehow turned real estate investments into an extraordinary fortune. Family gossip claimed she owned buildings all over New York City, though nobody seemed to know exactly how many. She'd gradually withdrawn from family gatherings after my grandmother passed away. Life simply drifted us apart. I'm afraid you've reached me too late," I said quietly. "We haven't spoken in years." "I'm very sorry to inform you that Miss Whitmore passed away 3 weeks ago." I closed my eyes. Even when someone lives a long life, death still lands with surprising weight. "I'm sorry to hear that." "There is, however, another reason for my call." He paused. "You've been named the principal beneficiary of her estate." For several seconds I honestly believed he'd confused me with another Margaret Carter. "There must be some mistake." "There is no mistake." He explained that the will had been reviewed multiple times, every legal requirement satisfied. Then he calmly listed what Aunt Eleanor had left me. $24 million? A historic office skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. Majority control of a charitable foundation she had established decades earlier. I couldn't speak. The library around me faded into silence. Finally I whispered, "Why me?" "I'm afraid I can't fully answer that over the phone. Miss Whitmore left a personal letter that may explain her decision. We'd like you to come to our office tomorrow morning." I leaned against a bookshelf because my knees suddenly felt weak. "There is one request." "Anything." "Until ownership transfers are finalized, we'd appreciate complete confidentiality." You have my word. After we ended the call, I simply stood there staring at rows of books. $24 million. The number didn't even seem real. Oddly enough, I wasn't thinking about vacations or jewelry or luxury cars. My first thought was Emily. She'd never have to worry about mortgage payments again. My second thought was Ben. His classroom constantly needed supplies that teachers usually bought themselves. Then I thought about Richard. Maybe this was finally our chance to slow down together. We'd traveled so little during our marriage. There were national parks we'd always talked about visiting. Small coastal towns in Maine, autumn drives through Vermont. Perhaps life was giving us one last beautiful chapter. I finished my shift in a daze before driving to pick up my grandchildren Lily and Noah from elementary school. The moment they climbed into my car, all my worries disappeared. Grandma, Noah, announced proudly, "I got 100 on my spelling test." Lily rolled her eyes. "He already told 3 people." "I got 100, he repeated. "I heard you," I laughed. On the drive home, they argued about whose turn it was to choose music, then begged for ice cream. I promised we'd celebrate soon. Neither child realized I was silently imagining college tuition, already paid futures, made easier burdens lifted before they even knew they existed. As we pulled into my neighborhood, I noticed something unusual. 2 expensive luxury SUVs sat in my driveway. Neither belonged to Richard. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. "Grandma?" Lily asked softly. "Everything's fine, sweetheart." But somehow, I already knew it wasn't. The moment I stepped out of the car, the afternoon felt unnaturally still. Even the birds seemed quieter. Lily slipped her small hand into mine. Noah reached for my other hand without saying a word. Children have a remarkable instinct. They often sense trouble long before adults admit it's there. Richard was standing on the front porch. He wasn't alone. Next to him stood a woman I'd never met in person, though I recognized her immediately from photographs I'd accidentally seen months earlier on social media. She was tall, impeccably dressed, probably in her mid-30s with perfectly styled blonde hair, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. Her name was Vanessa Collins. She was one of the top real estate agents in southern Westchester. I'd heard neighbors mention her more than once. I'd also seen her name appear on Richard's phone enough times for it to settle uncomfortably in the back of my mind. I had asked him once, "Who's Vanessa?" Without looking up from his dinner plate, he'd answered, "Commercial property agent. She's helping one of my clients." I had accepted the explanation. After 40 years of marriage, trust becomes less of a decision and more of a habit. Now I wished I had questioned that habit sooner. Several cardboard boxes were stacked beside the porch steps. My flower pots had been moved aside to make room for them. One box actually had my name written across the top in thick black marker. Maggie. Not Mom. Not Honey. Just Maggie. It struck me as colder than anything either of them could have said. Richard folded his arms. "You got here." His voice sounded almost businesslike. "I live here," I answered quietly. Vanessa smiled with the kind of politeness that never reaches the eyes. "I suppose we should get this over with." My heart began beating harder. I glanced at my grandchildren. "Kids, why don't you wait by the car for just a minute?" "No," Noah whispered. "I want to stay with you." Richard sighed impatiently. "They don't need to hear this." "Then maybe you shouldn't have chosen today." He looked away. That tiny gesture hurt more than shouting would have. Vanessa stepped forward carrying a manila envelope. Inside were several neatly organized documents. She handed them toward me. Richard didn't. She did. That alone told me more about my marriage than any conversation ever could. "These are divorce papers," Richard said. Just like that. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of 40 years together. Only facts. I filed several months ago. I stared at him. Several months. I wanted everything prepared before we talked. Prepared. Such an efficient word for dismantling an entire life. When exactly were you planning to tell me? When the timing made sense. I almost laughed. Timing. I'd spent decades arranging my own life around his timing, waiting until construction seasons slowed, waiting until business improved, waiting until retirement. Apparently I had waited too long. Vanessa slipped her arm through Richard's. The gesture wasn't affectionate. It was possessive. "I think honesty is healthier than pretending," she said. Her perfume drifted toward me, expensive and overpowering. Richard remained silent. She continued speaking as though she had every right. "The truth is, Richard has outgrown this marriage." I looked at him. "Is that how you feel?" He hesitated only briefly. "Yes, one word. 40 years erased by one word. I noticed Lily quietly wiping tears from her cheeks. Noah stepped closer until he was pressed against my side. My heart broke not for myself but for them. Children should never have to witness adults behaving this way. I crouched beside them. Would you two do Grandma a favor? They nodded. Mrs. Jenkins is probably gardening next door. Go ask if you can wait with her for a few minutes. I don't want to leave you, Lily whispered. I smiled as gently as I could. I'll be right there. Mrs. Jenkins had known our family for nearly 30 years. The moment she saw the children's faces, she hurried across her yard. Maggie, could they stay with you for just a little while? She looked from me to Richard, then to Vanessa. Her expression hardened. Of course. She took each child by the hand. As they walked away, Noah looked back over his shoulder. I love you, Grandma. I love you more. Only after they disappeared inside Mrs. Jenkins's house did I turn back toward my husband. Vanessa let out a dramatic sigh. Now that the audience is gone, she crossed her arms. I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting anything else. She smiled. Good. Then she looked directly at me. You've been living off Richard for years. I blinked. Living off Richard. I'd balanced his books, answered business calls, skipped vacations because payroll came first, sold my mother's jewelry to keep his company afloat during the recession. Yet somehow, I was the burden. She wasn't finished. You're old enough to understand when it's time to move on. Richard still said nothing. She gestured toward the boxes. We packed the essentials, as though 40 years could fit inside 6 cardboard boxes. My photographs, I asked. Richard shifted uncomfortably. They're in storage. My mother's china. We didn't think you'd need it. Need it. That china had survived 3 generations. Apparently, memories no longer qualified as necessities. Vanessa gave an exaggerated shrug. You can always buy new dishes. I looked at Richard one last time, truly hoping to see some flicker of the man I'd married. Instead, I saw exhaustion, cowardice, maybe even relief. I never wanted this to be ugly, he muttered. You brought another woman to our front porch. I know. No, I said softly. You don't. Vanessa seemed bored by the conversation. She glanced at her watch. Can we please finish this? She pointed toward the front door. You need to collect whatever's left and leave before dinner. I said nothing. She mistook my silence for surrender. Then she smiled wider. Pack your bags. She tilted her head ever so slightly. This house has no room for a leech. The words hung in the warm summer air. Mrs. Jenkins, standing behind her living room window, gasped loudly enough that I heard it from across the yard. Richard closed his eyes for a brief second. Even he seemed embarrassed. But he still didn't defend me. That was the moment something inside me became strangely calm. Not cold. Not angry. Simply calm. Because when people finally show you exactly who they are, confusion disappears. All that's left is clarity. I felt the thick envelope inside my purse. The attorney's letter. The inheritance documents, $24 million. A skyscraper. A new future waiting only a train ride away. Neither of them knew. Neither of them suspected. And somehow that secret made their cruelty feel smaller. I looked at Vanessa. Then at Richard. Then back at the house we'd bought together decades earlier. Finally, I smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile. It wasn't triumphant. It was the smile of someone who had just realized she wasn't the one losing everything. Vanessa frowned. What's so funny? I held her gaze. Then I answered in the calmest voice I'd used all day. Actually, I nodded toward the front door. This house belongs to me. Richard laughed first. A short, dismissive laugh. Vanessa joined him almost immediately. Oh, that's adorable, she said. You really are in denial. I shook my head. No. Then I looked directly at Richard. You remember the recession 15 years ago? His smile faded. When the construction company was nearly forced into bankruptcy, he didn't answer. You were terrified creditors would take the house. Now the color slowly drained from his face. I signed every document your attorney placed in front of me, I continued. One of them transferred the deed into my name to protect the property while your business recovered. Vanessa looked from him to me. What is she talking about? Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. You always said we'd transfer it back once things stabilized, I said gently. We never did. Silence settled over the porch. For the first time that afternoon, Richard looked genuinely afraid. Richard stared at me as though I had suddenly begun speaking another language. That's impossible, Vanessa said quickly, looking from his face to mine. Tell her she's wrong. Richard didn't answer. His silence told her more than any explanation could. "You changed the deed," I said quietly. "Your own attorney recommended it. You said it would only be temporary until the business recovered." Richard swallowed. "I thought it had been transferred back." "You thought?" Vanessa's confident smile disappeared. She turned sharply toward him. "You told me this house was yours." "It was supposed to be." I shook my head. "No, Richard, it was supposed to be ours." Neither of them spoke. I walked past the boxes without touching a single one. When I reached the front door, I took out my house key. It still fit. The lock clicked open with the familiar sound I'd heard thousands of times over 4 decades. Before stepping inside, I turned back. "I'll have my attorney review these divorce papers." Then I closed the door behind me. For the first time in years, the silence inside the house felt strangely peaceful. I leaned against the hallway wall and let out a long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands trembled, not because I doubted myself, because I had finally stopped pretending. 40 years of overlooking little disappointments had led to one enormous betrayal. The kitchen looked exactly as I'd left it that morning. My coffee mug still sat in the sink. A shopping list rested on the refrigerator beneath a magnet from Acadia National Park, where Richard and I had always planned to vacation after retirement. I looked at the magnet for a long moment. Then I quietly removed it. Some dreams no longer belonged on my refrigerator. A gentle knock came at the back door. Mrs. Jenkins stood there with Lily and Noah. "I thought you might need a hug," she said. I smiled. "I probably do." She embraced me without asking questions. Sometimes neighbors who've known you for 30 years don't need explanations. The children ran into the family room. Mrs. Jenkins lowered her voice. "Are you all right?" "I will be." She studied my face. "That's an unusual answer." It surprised me too. She squeezed my hand. "If you need anything tonight, call me." "I will." After she left, I made grilled cheese sandwiches for the children. Routine has a remarkable way of calming frightened hearts. Lily finally asked the question she'd been holding inside. "Grandma, are you and Grandpa mad at each other?" I chose my words carefully. "Sometimes adults make choices that hurt people." "Did Grandpa hurt you?" "Yes." She looked down at her plate. "Will you still be my grandma?" I reached across the table and touched her cheek. "There isn't anything in this world that could stop that." She smiled for the first time since we'd come home. That smile reminded me exactly why I couldn't allow bitterness to consume me. The children spent the night in our guest room. Richard never came back. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar Manhattan number. "Mrs. Carter," Mr. David Rosen said. "Yes, I wanted to confirm tomorrow morning's appointment." "I'll be there." "There are several documents requiring your signature. We also have Miss Whitmore's personal letter ready for you." His calm professionalism steadied me. After we hung up, I placed the confidential inheritance envelope on my dining room table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. $24 million. A skyscraper. The words still sounded impossible. Yet somehow they mattered less than they had earlier that afternoon. Money couldn't buy back trust. It couldn't erase humiliation. It certainly couldn't restore a marriage built on promises one person had quietly abandoned. Still, it represented something else. Freedom. The next morning after Emily picked up the children for summer camp, I drove to the Metro North station and boarded the train into Manhattan. I'd made that trip countless times over the years, usually for museum visits or Broadway matinees. This morning felt entirely different. As the skyline appeared beyond the Harlem River, I couldn't help wondering how many times Aunt Eleanor had looked at these same buildings while quietly deciding my future. The law firm's office occupied the 23rd floor of an elegant building near Bryant Park. Everything inside reflected understated success. Dark wood, fresh flowers, soft conversations. A receptionist greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Carter, Mr. Rosen is expecting you." David Rosen looked to be in his late 50s, wearing a navy suit and kind eyes behind thin-framed glasses. He shook my hand. "My condolences again for your loss." "Thank you." He led me into a spacious conference room overlooking Midtown. Several neatly organized folders waited on the polished table. "So," he said with a gentle smile, "shall we introduce you to your new responsibilities?" The next 2 hours passed in a blur of signatures, explanations, and astonishing numbers. Aunt Eleanor's estate was even more carefully organized than I'd imagined. The Midtown office building had been fully restored years earlier and was nearly completely leased to law firms, architects, and nonprofit organizations. Its rental income alone generated several $million annually. The $24 million wasn't sitting in stacks of cash, of course. It consisted of investment accounts, municipal bonds, certificates of deposit, and carefully managed funds designed to provide long-term stability. Then came the charitable foundation. It funded literacy programs, housing assistance for senior scholarships, and neighborhood libraries across New York State. I smiled. She supported libraries. Mr. Rosen smiled back, very generously. That somehow made perfect sense. Finally, he opened one last folder. This is Miss Whitmore's personal letter. The envelope had my name written in elegant blue ink. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded the pages. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Dear Maggie, if you're reading this, then I've finally run out of time. You may wonder why I chose you. The answer is surprisingly simple. I watched. I frowned. Watched. Mr. Rosen nodded. She anticipated that sentence would surprise you. I continued reading. A family doesn't reveal itself during holidays or weddings. It reveals itself during ordinary Tuesdays. I watched you visit your grandmother when others found excuses. I watched you quietly help your neighbors. I watched you support your husband without demanding recognition. I even visited your library several times over the past decade. Tears blurred the page. I had no idea. Money magnifies character. It does not create it. The wrong relatives wanted my buildings. You never wanted anything. That is precisely why you deserve them. By the time I reached the final paragraph, I was crying openly. Mr. Rosen respectfully looked out the window until I finished. I had no idea she knew me that well. Oh, he said softly, she knew you remarkably well. He slid another folder toward me. There is one matter we should discuss. What is it? Given the size of your inheritance, privacy will be important. News of the estate settlement will eventually become public. I understand. I would recommend saying as little as possible until you're ready. I nodded. There was one more secret I intended to keep. Richard still had no idea that while he believed he was divorcing a woman with modest savings, he had actually walked away from someone whose life had changed forever. And I wasn't sure yet whether that knowledge would ever come from me. The first thing I did after leaving David Rosen's office wasn't shopping. It wasn't looking at luxury apartments overlooking Central Park. It certainly wasn't buying an expensive handbag or making reservations at a 5-star restaurant. I walked 3 blocks to a quiet diner, ordered a cup of coffee and a turkey sandwich, and opened a yellow legal pad. For 40 years, I'd been the woman who planned everything from grocery budgets to holiday dinners, from children's college applications to payroll schedules during Richard's lean years. Now I had a different future to organize. I wrote one sentence across the top of the page. Don't let money change who you are. Then I underlined it twice. That piece of paper stayed in my purse for the next year. It became my compass whenever life threatened to spin too quickly. The following weeks passed in a blur of attorneys, accountants, and meetings. I learned more about commercial real estate than I'd ever imagined. The building Aunt Eleanor had left me wasn't just another office tower. It had stood in Midtown Manhattan for nearly a century. Its limestone exterior had survived wars, recessions, blackouts, and financial crises. Thousands of people walked through its revolving doors every weekday without ever knowing the quiet woman who now owned it. Every time I visited, I felt less like an owner and more like a caretaker. That suited me just fine. The property manager, Carlos Martinez, had worked there for 22 years. I've met a lot of building owners, he told me during one tour. They usually ask one question. What question? How much money can this place make? And I didn't. He smiled. You asked where the tenants eat lunch. I laughed. I suppose I did. You also asked which employees had worked here the longest. People matter. He nodded approvingly. I think Miss Whitmore chose well. Instead of replacing experienced staff, I listened to them. Instead of raising rents dramatically, I approved gradual improvements that benefited both tenants and employees. The lobby received better lighting and more comfortable seating. The elevators were modernized. The aging heating system was replaced before another harsh New York winter. Small decisions. Practical decisions, the sort of choices Aunt Eleanor herself probably would have made. Meanwhile, the charitable foundation held its first board meeting with me as chairwoman. I was nervous walking into that conference room. Most of the board members had known Aunt Eleanor for decades. Would they see me as an outsider? Instead, they welcomed me warmly. One gentleman in his 70s smiled. Eleanor always trusted her instincts. Another added, if she picked you, we're interested in hearing your ideas. My ideas were simple. Expand literacy programs, increase scholarships for community colleges and trade schools. Support libraries in underserved neighborhoods. Create grants for senior housing initiatives. None of those proposals made newspaper headlines. But they changed lives. Emily eventually agreed to leave her private practice and become the foundation's executive director. "I don't know if I'm qualified," she admitted. "You've spent your entire career helping people recover," I told her. "That's exactly what this foundation does." She accepted. Watching my daughter walk into meaningful work filled me with a pride no amount of money could ever equal. Ben became an educational advisor for the scholarship program. His experience as a public school teacher proved invaluable. "I know exactly which students fall through the cracks," he said during one planning session. "Then let's build something sturdy enough to catch them." He smiled. "You sound like Dad talking about construction." The comment caught both of us off guard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I answered softly, "I hope I'm building something stronger." At home, life remained complicated. Richard had moved into a condominium across town. Communication happened almost entirely through attorneys. His lawyer repeatedly requested that I vacate the family home while divorce negotiations continued. My attorney simply responded with copies of the property deed. The request stopped. Then another surprise arrived. My attorney Linda Harris asked me to meet with a forensic accountant. "I think you'll want to hear this in person," she said. The accountant spread several financial statements across a conference table. "I've reviewed your husband's business records. And there are significant irregularities." He pointed toward highlighted transactions. Corporate funds had paid for luxury vacations, jewelry purchases, a leased sports car, thousands of dollars in restaurant charges, all connected to Vanessa. I stared at the paperwork. "I thought Richard was paying for those personally." So did he. "What do you mean?" "The company paid." He slid another document toward me. "There are also undisclosed investment accounts." I felt my stomach tighten. Hidden from me, and potentially from tax authorities. The room suddenly seemed smaller. My marriage hadn't ended because Richard fell in love with someone else. It had been unraveling beneath my feet long before I realized it. There were missing funds, questionable bookkeeping, contracts that appeared unusually favorable to certain subcontractors. The accountant looked at me carefully. "Mrs. Carter, I want to be clear." "I appreciate that. We're not accusing anyone of crimes." "No, but these records deserve closer examination." I nodded slowly. "Then let the records speak for themselves." That became my approach. No anonymous phone calls. No revenge schemes. No public accusations. If Richard had broken laws, the truth would emerge through proper channels. I had no desire to destroy him. I simply refused to protect him anymore. Several months later, local business news finally announced that Aunt Eleanor Whitmore's estate had officially been settled. The mystery heir was no longer a mystery. My photograph appeared beside an article describing the foundation's expanded community initiatives. The headline wasn't about wealth. It focused on literacy grants and scholarships. I appreciated that. Late that afternoon, my cell phone rang. Richard. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, another call came. Then another. Finally, I listened. "Maggie." His voice sounded unlike any I'd heard before. You inherited Eleanor Whitmore's estate." I said nothing. He continued. "I just saw the news." Another long silence. "I didn't know." "No," I whispered to the empty room. "You didn't." The next voicemail arrived from Vanessa. Her tone was dramatically different from the woman who'd stood on my porch. "Margaret, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot." I almost smiled. The wrong foot? That was certainly one way to describe someone telling a 62-year-old grandmother to pack her bags. She continued. "I'd really love to meet for coffee." I deleted the message before it finished. The following week, Richard began sending handwritten letters. Not emails. Not text messages, actual letters. He apologized for being distant. He admitted he'd handled everything poorly. He wrote that 40 years couldn't simply be erased. For the first time in months, I cried. Not because I wanted him back, but because I finally understood something painful. He hadn't written those letters when he believed I was an ordinary retired librarian. He wrote them after discovering I owned a Manhattan skyscraper. That realization ended the last fragile thread of hope I hadn't even known was still hanging on. Money hadn't changed me. It had simply revealed everyone else. The first snow of December arrived earlier than expected. I stood in my kitchen watching soft white flakes settle across the backyard, the same backyard where Richard had once taught Ben to throw a baseball, and where Emily had insisted every snowman needed a proper scarf. It was strange how a place could hold beautiful memories and painful ones without asking permission. The divorce was finalized just before Christmas. There was no courtroom drama, no shouting, no dramatic speeches, just signatures a judge and the quiet ending of a marriage that had lasted nearly 41 years. When I walked out of the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in a very long time. Not happy. Healing isn't the same thing as happiness, but free. The forensic accountant's findings continued moving through the proper legal channels. Several months later, Linda Harris called. I thought you should hear this from me before it reaches the newspapers. I sat down at my dining room table. What happened? Federal auditors have opened a formal review of Richard's company. I closed my eyes. So it begins. The investigation wasn't started because of anything you did, she reminded me. I know. The accounting discrepancies had eventually reached the attention of regulators through routine legal disclosures connected to the divorce proceedings and corporate filings. No anonymous tips. No secret revenge. Just paperwork. Sometimes the truth doesn't need help. It simply needs daylight. By spring, local business publications began reporting that Richard's construction company was facing serious financial trouble. Several commercial projects had stalled. Banks tightened lending. Longtime clients quietly took their business elsewhere. Then came civil lawsuits from subcontractors claiming unpaid invoices. One morning, Ben called. Mom, are you sitting down? I am now. The company filed for bankruptcy protection. I was silent for several moments. That business had once been our shared dream. I'd watched it grow from one pickup truck and a folding card table into a respected regional contractor. Seeing it collapse felt strangely similar to watching an old family home being demolished. Necessary, perhaps, but still heartbreaking. I never wanted this, I admitted. I know, Ben said gently. You just stopped carrying it. His words stayed with me. A week later, another piece of news spread through town. Vanessa had left Richard. Not quietly either. One of Emily's friends who worked in commercial real estate reluctantly mentioned that Vanessa had been seen attending charity galas with another developer from Connecticut. Apparently, he owned several luxury apartment complexes. Emily hesitated before telling me. I wasn't sure you wanted to know. I appreciate your honesty. Does it make you feel satisfied? I thought carefully before answering. No. She looked surprised. I don't enjoy watching people discover that selfish choices have consequences. But she hurt you. Yes. And Dad? Yes. I poured us both another cup of tea. Emily, revenge sounds exciting in stories. She smiled faintly. But in real life it usually arrives looking a lot like sadness. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you. I've made plenty of mistakes. Not this time. Several weeks later my phone rang again. Richard. This time I answered. Hello. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. Maggie, would you meet me? I hesitated. I don't think that's wise. Please. There was a long silence. I don't want anything. Another pause. I just want one honest conversation. I agreed. We met at a small diner halfway between our homes. It wasn't an expensive place. In fact, we'd eaten there many Saturday mornings during the early years of our marriage when pancakes cost less than $2. The waitress recognized us immediately. Haven't seen you two together in a while. Richard forced a smile. It's been some time. She poured coffee and politely left us alone. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Age had changed Richard over the past year. His shoulders seemed lower. His hair had become almost completely gray. The confidence that once filled every room had quietly disappeared. Finally, he looked at me. I'm sorry. I waited. No excuses followed. No explanations. Just those two words. I'm sorry for all of it. I folded my hands around my coffee cup. Go on. I thought success meant never looking back. His eyes filled with tears. I kept chasing bigger contracts, bigger houses, bigger everything. He shook his head. I stopped noticing the people who made any of it possible. I listened. I convinced myself you would always be there. Another silence. I confused loyalty with weakness. That sentence hurt more than everything else he'd said. Because it was true. He looked down at the table. When Vanessa came along, he sighed. She admired the version of me I wanted to believe existed. The successful businessman. Exactly. And I enjoyed being admired. He laughed bitterly. Turns out she admired my money even more. Neither of us smiled. I deserved that lesson. I watched steam rise from my coffee. You know what surprised me most? He looked up. You never tried to ruin me. I didn't need to. I know. His voice cracked. You simply stopped protecting me. There it was. The truth. For decades, I had quietly solved problems before they reached him. Balanced accounts. Smoothed relationships, made excuses, covered mistakes. When I stopped doing those things, he had to face himself. I've had a lot of time to think, he continued. I keep remembering little things, like the nights you stayed awake doing payroll. The birthday you canceled because one of my employees needed emergency surgery. He smiled sadly. I don't think I thanked you even once. You didn't. I'm thanking you now. I nodded. Thank you. Those words were nearly 40 years late, but they were sincere. Richard took a deep breath. I don't expect another chance. There isn't one. I know. I've forgiven you. He looked startled. You have. Forgiveness isn't the same as reconciliation. I spoke slowly, choosing every word with care. I refuse to carry bitterness for the rest of my life. He wiped his eyes. But I also won't pretend trust can be rebuilt after what happened. He nodded. I understand. I truly hope you build a peaceful life. I'll try. As we stood to leave, he hesitated. Maggie, yes? I always thought inheriting millions made you the richest person in the room. He looked directly at me. I was wrong. Before I could answer, he quietly added, You were richer than me long before your aunt ever wrote that will. He walked out into the afternoon sunshine alone. I watched him cross the parking lot with slower steps than I remembered. For the first time since everything had happened, I didn't see an enemy. I saw an aging man who had traded away the best parts of his life before realizing their value. That wasn't a victory. It was simply the truth. And somehow, the truth was enough. A year after I stood on my front porch with divorce papers in one hand and the biggest secret of my life in the other, I found myself standing on the rooftop terrace of the Manhattan building Aunt Eleanor had entrusted to me. The city stretched out in every direction. Yellow taxis drifted through the streets below like tiny moving pieces on a game board. The afternoon sun reflected off glass towers while older brick buildings reminded me that New York had always found a way to blend yesterday with tomorrow. I rested my hands on the stone railing. For a long moment I simply breathed. When I first inherited this building, I thought it represented wealth. Now I understood it represented responsibility. Money can change your address. Character determines whether people are glad you arrived. The foundation had completed its first full year under my leadership. Instead of shrinking, it had grown. We expanded literacy programs to dozens of libraries across New York State. We created scholarships for students attending community colleges, trade schools, and nursing programs. We partnered with organizations that repaired homes for low-income seniors, helping older Americans remain safely in the neighborhoods they had spent their lives building. One of my favorite projects involved converting an unused floor of the office building into a nonprofit resource center. Every week, veterans met there for employment counseling. Senior citizens attended free financial planning workshops. Small community organizations finally had affordable meeting space in Midtown. Whenever I walked through those halls and heard people laughing over coffee, I thought about Aunt Eleanor. She had understood something many wealthy people never do. Buildings are only valuable because people fill them with purpose. Emily flourished as executive director of the foundation. Watching her confidence grow was one of the greatest joys of my life. She no longer worried about making mortgage payments every month. Instead, she spent her days helping other families find opportunities they never imagined possible. One evening, she stopped by my house after work carrying a stack of scholarship applications. She smiled. Mom, do you realize we've awarded more than 200 scholarships this year? I smiled back. I was hoping you'd tell me that. She laughed. You always pretend you don't already know the numbers. I like hearing you say them. She sat beside me at the kitchen table. I think Aunt Eleanor would be proud. I hope so. Ben continued teaching history at the same public high school. Despite my encouragement, he refused to leave the classroom. Mom, he said one afternoon, some jobs aren't supposed to make you rich. I know. They're supposed to make you useful. He agreed to oversee the foundation's educational partnerships, but only on evenings and weekends. My students still need me Monday morning, he insisted. I couldn't have been prouder. As for Richard, life had become much quieter. After losing his company, he accepted a volunteer position with a nonprofit organization that helped seniors navigate housing and financial challenges after retirement. When I first heard about it, I smiled. He had spent decades building office buildings. Now he spent his days helping older people keep roofs over their heads. There was something fitting about that. Family gatherings gradually became less awkward. The first Thanksgiving was difficult. Everyone measured every conversation carefully. The second felt easier. By Christmas, the grandchildren had stopped worrying about where everyone should sit. Children often lead adults back toward normalcy. One warm Saturday afternoon the following spring, Emily hosted a birthday party for Noah, who had just turned 11. The backyard overflowed with balloons, folding chairs, hamburgers on the grill, and grandchildren chasing one another through the grass. Richard arrived carrying a carefully wrapped present. He looked at me across the yard. I smiled politely. He smiled back. No bitterness. No pretending the past hadn't happened. Simply two older people who understood that peace sometimes looks different than the future we once imagined. Later that afternoon, Lily, now 13, wandered over while I sat beneath the maple tree. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart." She leaned against my shoulder. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you ever really angry at Grandpa?" I looked across the yard. Richard was helping Noah assemble a new telescope. He laughed as the boy accidentally pointed it backward. For a long moment I watched them. Then I answered honestly. "Yes." "Really angry?" "Very." "What changed?" I thought carefully before speaking. "If I had stayed angry forever, I would have let his mistakes keep controlling my life." She considered that. "So forgiving someone isn't saying what they did was okay?" "No. It's saying you won't let what they did decide who you become." She nodded slowly. "I think I understand."